Hey guys, tonight we step into a warm pocket of darkness where the modern world goes quiet and the oldest kind of light takes over. You can almost see it, a small oil lamp trembling on a low table, a thin flame painting soft gold across wet clay, and the shadow of a reed stylus moving like a slow insect across the surface. Outside, the night air is cool, and somewhere beyond the walls a river breathes in the dark. We're talking about Sumerian texts and the stories people later connected to the Anunnaki, but we're going to keep our footing careful and honest. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? The language might suggest more than one meaning historians debate, and will stay gentle with every claim. Also, you probably won't survive this in the literal sense, because if you tried doing a full day of scribal work in a mud brick room with zero air conditioning, you'd quit by lunch and start bargaining with the nearest donkey. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop your location and your local time in the comments, because I love picturing this as one big quiet campfire across the planet. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in a city that is both familiar and completely alien the way a dream can be. The streets are narrow and uneven, packed earth, pressed down by countless bare feet, and the occasional cartwheel that groans like it's complaining about its job. Mud brick walls rise on either side, their surfaces rough and warm from the day's sun, and if you run your fingertips along them, you feel grit and straw. Above you, the sky is a deep velvet black, and the stars are sharp enough to look like they could prick you. Most historians agree that in southern Mesopotamia, in places like Uruk and Ur, and nearby city-states, people built dense urban lives, earlier than almost anywhere else we can clearly document. Archaeology suggests canals, fields, storehouses and temples formed a kind of living machine that turned river water into grain, into bread, and bread into the energy that kept a city breathing. The evidence we do have points to a society that was practical to its bones, and yet absolutely drenched in ritual and story, as if practicality alone was never enough. You slip into a quieter space, a courtyard, where the air smells faintly of damp clay and smoke. Somewhere a dog barks once, then thinks better of it. You can hear the small sounds of life, a baby fussing a murmured argument, a splash of water being poured into a jar. And then you find the place where the night's real magic happens. Not the dramatic kind with thunder and glowing portals, but the magic of record keeping. A scribal room. Archaeology suggests that scribes trained hard, practicing signs again and again until their hands knew them without thinking. A careful reading might suggest that for them writing was not just communication, but control of grain, control of labour, control of offerings, control of memory itself. What's broadly accepted is that cuneiform, those wedge-shaped impressions, became a tool that could make an idea durable. Your voice fades after you speak, but a clay tablet can outlast empires if it dries in the right corner and luck stays kind. The lamp in the corner throws light in a soft oval, and inside that oval you see clay tablets stacked like small bricks of thought. Some are simple practical lists, amounts of barley, counts of sheep, names of workers. Others carry hymns, myths, prayers, laments, and royal boasts that sound like someone trying to talk the universe into behaving. The evidence we do have points to both kinds of texts existing side by side. The way your own life has grocery lists in the same phone that stores your most emotional messages. And here, right at the start, is where the Anunnaki come in, not as a single settled truth, but as a word that lives at the edge of many stories. Historians still argue whether the term Anunnaki always meant the same thing across time and place, or whether it shifted like a shadow depending on who was speaking, when they were speaking, and what they needed the divine world to do for them. That debate matters because it's the difference between treating a word as a fixed label and treating it as a category that evolves. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion was not static. Gods changed roles, city priorities shifted, empires rose and reorganized the divine hierarchy the way new managers reorganize an office. You can almost imagine a bored scribe rolling his eyes and saying very politely, "Yes, yes, the gods are restructured this year. Please update your prayers accordingly." One interpretation is that when ancient texts talk about gods coming down or descending, it often reflects authority, becoming present, a temple asserting power, a king claiming legitimacy, a city declaring itself favoured. A more cautious explanation could be that these phrases are poetic ceremonial language, not eyewitness description. And yet, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the imagery is designed to feel like arrival? Because arrival is emotionally potent, because it makes listeners lean forward, because it makes the night air feel charged. You're not proving anything tonight. You are following clues. You pick up a tablet. It's cool at first, then warms slightly against your palm. The clay holds tiny ridges where the stylus pressed in, and the marks look like a field of angled footprints. If you tilt it toward the lamp, the wedges cast little shadows, and suddenly you understand why people can fall in love with ancient writing. It isn't just text, it's texture, it's physical. It's the past refusing to be purely abstract. Archaeology suggests these tablets were made quickly, often while the clay was still soft, then dried in the sun. Some were later baked hard, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally, in fires that destroyed buildings but preserved the writing. The evidence we do have points to a strange irony. Disaster can be a kind of archivist. A city burns and the records become permanent. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now you turn the tablet in your hands and imagine the person who made it. A young apprentice, perhaps, knees aching on a reed mat, practicing sign after sign until their wrist hurts. Or an experienced scribe working fast because the temple needs numbers by sunrise, and the grain doesn't count itself. Most historians agree that scribes were among the most educated people in their communities, trained in complex writing systems and mathematical methods. One interpretation is that scribes weren't merely recording reality, They were shaping it, because what gets written becomes what gets enforced. What if that means the texts carry not just information, but intention? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You step closer to the doorway and look out toward the city. In the distance, you can see the outline of a temple complex rising like a dark mountain against the stars. It doesn't glitter. It doesn't hum with science fiction energy. It just sits there heavy and certain the way institutions always do. Archaeology suggests these temple complexes were economic centres storing goods, organising labour and anchoring the city's ritual life. What's broadly accepted is that the divine world and the administrative world were tightly intertwined. If you wanted bread, you needed barley. If you wanted barley, you needed water. If you wanted water rights, you needed social order. If you wanted social order, you probably needed a god's name stamped on it somewhere. Here's a mainstream safe anchor you can hold on to. People in Sumer wrote to manage a complicated life. They wrote because their world was too intricate to keep only in memory. They wrote because writing turns chaos into columns. Now comes the myths carefully labelled. A fringe idea proposes that some of these stories are not only symbolic or religious, but literal accounts of extraordinary visitors. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were beings from the sky who came to Earth and changed human fate. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists partly because the language of descent and divine assembly can sound like a narrative of arrival if you read it with modern ears. To be clear, this is debated. The evidence for literal extraterrestrial visitation is thin in the mainstream academic view, and many scholars would say the texts reflect mythic thinking, political legitimacy, and cultural storytelling rather than historical reporting of non-human contact. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts are real, the myths are real, the word Anunnaki is real. But the leap from mythic language to a literal alien event is a possibility some people imagine, not a certainty we can confirm. Still, the human mind loves a doorway. And that brings us back to you standing in the lamplight holding clay like it's a warm stone. You can feel how easy it would be at night with the river whispering and the stars sharp above the flat horizon to look up and think the sky is not just empty distance. Archaeology suggests Mesopotamians watched the heavens closely tracking patterns for calendars and omens. One interpretation is that intense skywatching makes the heavens feel intimate, like a neighbour's window you can't help glancing at. And what if in that intimacy stories of gods became stories of visitors, because visitor is the oldest shape of mystery. You put the tablet down carefully as if it might wake. The lamp flickers, and for a moment the shadows on the walls look like moving figures. Not monsters, not invaders, just the restless shapes the mind invents when it has too much darkness and too much imagination. You notice a small repeated motif in the room, the reed stylus. It lies there, simple and blunt, the tool that turns thought into wedges. It's an ordinary object, and yet tonight it feels like a key. Most historians agree that tools define what a society can store and transmit. A careful reading might suggest that the stylus is the true arrival in this story. the thing that landed in human hands and changed everything? What if the Anunnaki, in the calmest interpretation, represent the moment humans began to treat knowledge as something you can press into matter? Historians still argue whether the earliest myths were composed to explain natural forces, to justify social hierarchies, to provide comfort, or to do all of that at once. There's no full consensus, and that's okay. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You take one slow breath. The night air tastes like dust and smoke and river dampness. The city settles around you, and the lamp's hum becomes almost like a tiny mechanical heartbeat. You're here in the oldest newsroom on Earth, where stories are set down not to entertain but to endure. And as you look at the silent stack of tablets, you realise the real hook isn't aliens or gods or the word Anunnaki. The hook is that someone long ago decided the night should remember. You keep moving, not with the brisk confidence of a tourist, but with the slow, careful pace of someone who knows the ground is uneven and the night has corners. The lamp-lit scribal room fades behind you, yet the smell of warm clay and smoke clings to your sleeves like a quiet souvenir. Somewhere in the city, a door shuts wood against wood, and the sound carries farther than it should because there are fewer modern noises to swallow it. Outside, the air feels cooler now. You step into a street that slopes gently, and the city seems arranged around one central fact: water is life, and life is scheduled. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia depended on the Tigris and Euphrates river system, and that irrigation and canal management were fundamental to farming and urban growth. Archaeology suggests canals were dug and maintained with intense labour, and that these networks turned seasonal river moods into predictable harvests. The evidence we do have points to people making a kind of bargain with nature. We will work with mud and water, and in return you will let us eat. One interpretation is that when Sumerian texts speak about order being established, boundaries being set and chaos being pushed back, they're echoing the daily experience of controlling water. A more cautious explanation could be that mythic cosmic order is simply the poetic language of social order and agricultural planning. And yet, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the recurring images of rivers' gates and measured flow are not only about farming, but about how information itself begins to move like water? You walk toward the sound of it. The river is not a single clean line here. It's a presence, a breathing system of channels, basins, and slow-moving veins. Under the starlight, you can't see the whole network, but you sense it the way you sense a sleeping animal in the dark by the shape of the silence around it. The banks smell earthy and alive, a mix of wet reeds, silt, and something faintly sweet like crushed plants. Archaeology suggests that the earliest city growth in the region involved not just building walls and temples, but also organising the landscape into fields and canals. What's broadly accepted is that this required cooperation and hierarchy. People had to decide who dug where, who repaired what, who received water first when the flow was low. You can feel it even now in the way paths lead toward canal edges, in the way small bridges force you to slow down and balance your weight. And here's where the mystery begins to sit alongside the mainstream, not as a replacement, but as a second layer you can look at if you want. Historians still argue whether early Mesopotamian political power emerged primarily from temple institutions managing resources, or from competing households and leaders, or from some shifting mix of both that changed over centuries. There's no full consensus, and it matters because it changes how you read the stories. If temples were central managers, then myths might sound like administrative poetry. If kings and households drove power, then myths might sound like propaganda. If it's a blend, then myths are a messy mirror reflecting whoever is holding the stylus at the moment. You pause near a canal gate, a simple structure of wood and packed earth that can direct flow. It's not glamorous, it's not dramatic, it's the kind of engineering that makes a society possible without anyone writing songs about it. And yet you can't help it. You do feel a little dramatic because you're standing beside the original switchboard of civilization. You can almost imagine the daily scene. Men and women carrying baskets of silt, children running messages, someone shouting about a blocked channel, someone else shouting back because of course they do. Water rights were not a soft topic. They were lunch. Most historians agree that disputes over water and land were part of Mesopotamian life, just as they are in farming societies everywhere. The evidence we do have points to legal texts and administrative tablets that record property boundaries, labour assignments and rations. Archaeology suggests these records are the paperwork of survival. One interpretation is that the world of gods in this context becomes a way to place moral weight on resource allocation. A careful reading might suggest that when a text says a god grants fertility or restores order, it may be reflecting human systems deciding who gets what when. But then gently the mist. A fringe idea proposes that references to beings from above reflect literal outsiders, perhaps visitors interpreted through religious language. A popular rumour claims that something arrived, something that influenced the earliest organisation of life, and that the stories of divine instruction are really coded reports. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers because it offers a dramatic explanation for something that is already dramatic: the rapid appearance of complex urban systems. To be clear, this is debated. The mainstream explanation does not need extraterrestrials to account for irrigation administration and early cities. Humans are perfectly capable of inventing bureaucracy all on their own, and they do it with terrifying enthusiasm. If you doubt that, just try renewing a driver's license in a country that requires 3 copies of the same form. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary support, and the evidence here in the academic consensus points toward human innovation shaped by environment, not confirmed contact with non-human visitors. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea becomes a storytelling lens, a way to wonder without pretending we've solved anything. You keep walking along the canal, and now you notice the way the city's sound changes near water. Footsteps soften, voices carry differently. The air feels slightly cooler, and the stars seem to sit lower on the horizon because you're looking out over flatter land. Archaeology suggests that early Mesopotamian communities also relied on trade and exchange, because the alluvial plain lacked certain resources like stone and metal. What's broadly accepted is that this created networks of contact people moving goods along rivers and paths, exchanging barley and textiles for things that didn't grow out of the mud. One interpretation is that arrival stories may be intensified by the experience of foreign goods appearing from far away. A careful reading might suggest that when a myth describes something precious coming down, it could echo the excitement of rare materials entering a city. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the earliest sense of sky as a source of gifts is partly a metaphor for distance, for the way things appear from beyond the horizon and feel like miracles because you didn't see the journey? You stop again because the canal widens into a basin where water slows. The surface reflects a trembling ribbon of starlight. You lean down and watch your reflection wobble. It's you, but also not you, because the water is never perfectly honest. The evidence we do have points to Sumerian life being intensely practical and yet steeped in symbolic thinking. Most historians agree that the Mesopotamians looked for meaning in patterns in the sky, in animal behaviour, in dreams. Archaeology suggests that temple complexes and ritual spaces were designed to connect people to a sense of cosmic order. One interpretation is that this pattern-seeking habit makes stories of divine intervention almost inevitable. When you live on a floodplain that can swing from abundance to catastrophe, you crave explanation and control. Historians still argue whether the earliest flood stories in Mesopotamia began as direct memories of local disasters or as mythic motifs that circulated and evolved, or as some combination where real events fed symbolic storytelling. Even here, in the mainstream, uncertainty is part of the landscape. The river doesn't sign contracts. You notice something small near the water's edge, a reed bundle. Maybe it's meant for weaving, maybe for repair. Maybe someone simply left it there and will regret it later. The reed becomes your motif again, the same humble plant that makes mats, boats, baskets and styluses. It's almost funny how much civilization rests on reeds. If your entire society is built on grass and mud, you learn not to get too proud. You pick up a reed and roll it between your fingers. It's light, flexible, and surprisingly tough. Most historians agree that reeds were essential to daily life here, from construction to writing tools. A careful reading might suggest that the materials themselves shape the culture's metaphors. If reeds connect everything, then stories might connect everything too. Now with the canal beside you, you start to feel how a city is not just buildings, it is flow. Flow of water, flow of goods, flow of instructions, flow of belief. The scribal room you left behind is part of the same system. Tablets are water you can hold. Archaeology suggests that administrative tablets often recorded rations and labour, giving us a window into how organised the economy could be. What's broadly accepted is that people were assigned tasks and paid in goods, and that the temple and palace institutions played major roles. One interpretation is that such systems could feel to an ordinary worker like an invisible force deciding their fate. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply how complex societies operate. And yet, what if the gods in some stories are partly the face people put on the system itself, the way you might curse the algorithm today as if it were a moody deity? You can almost hear a tired worker muttering something like, "Enlil again, huh? Sure blame Enlil. Meanwhile, I'm the one in the mud." A fringe idea proposes that the language of those who came from above might reflect an actual perceived external authority, perhaps strangers with advanced knowledge remembered through myth. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because it turns bureaucracy into drama and makes history feel like a mystery movie. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The solid ground here remains human labour and environmental adaptation. Still, you're allowed to wonder. You're allowed to ask softly what the words feel like when you read them at night. You turn away from the canal basin and walk toward the darker outline of the city again. The temple silhouette rises ahead, steady and patient. The air smells of smoke, and somewhere someone is baking bread, because no matter what century you're in, people are always baking bread, like the world depends on it. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian city life was a balance of mud, water, grain, and belief. One interpretation is that the myths, including stories tied to divine groups like the Anunnaki, are layered reflections of that balance. And what if, just for a moment, you imagine the city itself as a kind of listening instrument tuned to rivers and stars and the texts as the record of what it thought it heard? Historians still argue whether the deepest meaning of these early narratives is theological, political, ecological, or psychological. There's no full consensus. And that's part of why you keep walking, because the night is long, the water keeps moving, and the tablets are waiting. You drift closer to the temple complex, the way you drift toward a lighthouse, not because it's pulling you with magic, but because it's the largest shape on the horizon and your feet keep choosing the clearest path. The ground firms up as you leave the canal edge and step onto packed earth that has been pressed by centuries of sandals. The air changes too. Less river dampness, now more smoke and grain, and something sharp that might be animal fat used for lamps. The temple rises in layers broad and heavy, a human-made mountain built from mud brick, reed matting, and relentless organisation. Under starlight, it looks almost black, but where torchlight catches the edges, you see warm browns and faint lines of plaster. Somewhere inside, a deeper quiet lives, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but supervised. Most historians agree that temples in ancient Sumer were not only religious spaces but also major economic and administrative centres. Archaeology suggests these complexes managed land-stored grain, organised labour, and served as focal points for festivals and offerings. The evidence we do have points to a world where worship and paperwork were not separate hobbies. If you wanted to be fed, you often needed to be counted, and being counted could feel like being blessed. You step through an outer entryway and feel the subtle shift in social gravity. People move differently here. Voices soften, postures straighten. Even the dogs seem less confident about barking. One interpretation is that sacred spaces train the body. You start behaving as if something is watching because something is always watching, even if it's just other humans. A more cautious explanation could be that this is normal in any place where authority gathers. Still, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the architecture itself is meant to create the sensation of presence, so that the gods are here becomes a feeling before it becomes a belief? You pass a low area where offerings might be arranged. Bowls, jars, baskets. The smell of food is faint but real, as if the air remembers it. Archaeology suggests offerings included grain, beer, livestock, and crafted goods, and that temples distributed rations to workers. What's broadly accepted is that gods were honoured through material exchange, and that this exchange also sustained the institution. And now, very gently, you begin to see why a group like the Anunnaki can appear in a story and feel both cosmic and administrative at once. Historians still argue whether certain divine groups were imagined primarily as mythic families, as personifications of natural forces, or as symbolic reflections of social hierarchy. There's no full consensus because the texts come from different time cities and scribal traditions, and the divine world shifts as human power shifts. You keep walking and notice the small practical details. A storehouse door reinforced with wood, a guard-like figure lingering near a passage, a worker carrying a basket with the careful posture of someone who has done this 1,000 times. This is not a place built only for prayer, it is built for flow of goods, flow of labour, flow of attention. Most historians agree that temple institutions played central roles in organising early urban life, especially in the 3rd millennium BCE. Archaeology suggests large-scale storage and redistribution systems existed. The evidence we do have points to a society that could coordinate many hands toward one schedule, which is impressive and also a little exhausting to imagine. Now your attention catches on a sound, chanting low and rhythmic, coming from deeper inside. Not loud, not theatrical, more like a steady hum, the kind you could fall asleep to if you weren't trying to decode the meaning of the universe. You move closer and the chant blends with soft percussion, maybe a hand on a drum, maybe clapping. The rhythm is slow enough to feel like breathing. It makes your mind settle into a quieter lane. One interpretation is that ritual sound was designed to synchronize people, to make a crowd feel like one body, to turn individual worry into shared attention. A more cautious explanation could be that it simply kept the ceremony ordered and memorable. And what if in the dimness those rhythms also made stories feel more real, so that they came down becomes a felt experience rather than a debated line of text? Archaeology suggests that temple festivals involved processions, music, food, and symbolic actions tied to gods and kings. What's broadly accepted is that such events reinforced community identity. The evidence we do have points to people needing reassurance that life had structure, that the rivers would return, that the harvest could be trusted, that the city's gods had not forgotten them. You stop near a wall where smoke has left a faint stain, and you realise how much of religion is sensory: smell, sound, light, texture. You could explain the theology to someone, but it's the incense that convinces their body. Now the reed stylus motif returns in a new form, a small stack of tablets near an official-looking figure. The tablets aren't hymns, they're lists, names, numbers, rations. Most historians agree that temples often kept detailed administrative records. Archaeology suggests scribes worked closely with institutions to track goods and labour. The evidence we do have points to writing being part of sacred practice, because maintaining order was itself considered holy. A careful reading might suggest that when texts speak of divine decrees, they may reflect the human habit of making decisions feel backed by cosmic authority. One interpretation is that a decree of the gods could function like the ultimate stamp of approval. A more cautious explanation could be that it's metaphor, a poetic way to say this is the way things are. And yet, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if decree is also an echo of real human decrees that controlled life so thoroughly they felt otherworldly? You can't help thinking with gentle sarcasm that if the gods were in charge of rations, they were also in charge of disappointment. If you got a smaller bowl of barley than your neighbour, you could blame the divine plan instead of starting a fight. Convenient. Now the mist layer carefully labelled. A fringe idea proposes that the temple's descending gods reflect literal arrivals or visits remembered through ritual reenactment. A popular rumour claims that priests preserved secret knowledge of non-human beings, and that offerings were not only symbolic but diplomatic. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's emotionally sticky because it turns ceremony into contact. To be clear, this is debated. The mainstream view sees temples as human institutions expressing human religious and political needs, not confirmed embassies for extraterrestrials. Let me rephrase that more carefully. There is a difference between saying the texts describe gods and saying the texts report measurable historical encounters with non-human visitors. The first is documented as belief and literature. The second is a possibility some people imagine, not a certainty supported by broad evidence. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, you watch a ritual moment unfold. A priest-like figure lifts a vessel, pours liquid in a controlled stream, and the liquid darkens the earth. Beer perhaps, or water or oil. The action is slow and deliberate. Archaeology suggests libations were common, and that such acts symbolized offering and connection. What's broadly accepted is that rituals created a bridge between ordinary life and sacred story. One interpretation is that the careful pouring mirrors irrigation again controlled flow as sacred act. A careful reading might suggest that ritual repeats the logic of the landscape. Water is measured, grain is measured, words are measured. Even the divine is measured because measurement is how you survive. Historians still argue whether the earliest myths were meant primarily to be performed read aloud or preserved as elite texts within scribal culture. There's no full consensus, and it changes how you imagine the audience. If myths were performed publicly, then they shaped broad community identity. If they were scribal property, then they shaped elite worldview and policy. Either way, the words mattered. You move to the edge of a courtyard and look up. The stars are still there, indifferent. Yet from inside the temple complex, the sky feels framed like it's part of the architecture. The heavens are not just above you, they are part of the room. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian religion linked gods to celestial bodies and natural forces especially in later developments of astronomy and omen literature. What's broadly accepted is that skywatching and religion intertwined over time. One interpretation is that calling gods of the sky reflects genuine attention to the heavens. A more cautious explanation could be that sky is simply the highest symbolic space, the place you assign ultimate authority. And what if in the calm imagination lane, you picture a night when something unusual crossed that sky, a slow-moving light, a rare meteor, a strange alignment, and a priest pointed and said, in the language available to them, they have come down. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and for literal visits it stays thin. Still the feeling is real. The way the temple makes you smaller, the way the chant makes your thoughts slow, the way the administrative tablets sit beside the hymns, as if the sacred and the practical are one breath. You take another slow breath and notice a small detail. A bowl of clay partly filled with water reflecting the lamplight. The reflection wobbles slightly and it reminds you of the canal basin again. The motif returns water and writing flow and record the reed connecting everything. Most historians agree that Sumerian civilization was built by ordinary people doing extraordinary coordination. Archaeology suggests temples anchored that coordination. One interpretation is that divine stories, including those involving groups like the Anunnaki, serve to justify and stabilize complex systems. And what if, just for a moment, you let the possibility float, that the arrival story is less about beings and more about the moment society itself arrived, stepping down from scattered villages into the heavy organised shape of a city. The chant continues low and steady like a lullaby for the world's first bureaucracy. You leave the temple complex with that lingering sensation that you've been inside a machine that runs on belief. The chanting fades behind you and the night opens up again, wider and less supervised. Your footsteps sound louder now on the packed earth, as if the city is listening and taking notes. Somewhere a lamp flares in a doorway, and for a second you see a face turn your way, then disappear back into shadow, the universal gesture of late-night curiosity. The reed stylus motif follows you not as an object in your hand this time, but as a feeling of marks and lists and decisions pressed into clay. You can almost hear the scratch of the stylus without hearing it, like phantom typing. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian societies developed kingship and complex political structures over time, and that rulers used monuments, ritual and writing to legitimize authority. Archaeology suggests cities like Uruk expanded in influence, and that leaders tied themselves to gods to strengthen their claims. The evidence we do have points to power needing a story because raw power is never satisfied with being raw. You find your way into a quieter alley where the air smells of dust and baked brick. The street narrows and the buildings feel closer, making the sky above look like a thin strip of stars. Up ahead you notice a small building with light seeping out, the kind of place where someone is awake because they have to be, not because they want to be. Inside you see it the king list kind of world. A stack of tablets sits beside a low bench. A figure leans over, not singing hymns now, but counting. The posture is familiar. Shoulders slightly hunched, attention focused the body in service to record. You step closer and see lines of names impressed into clay, orderly and severe. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamia produced king lists and other texts that record sequences of rulers, sometimes with astonishingly long reign lengths in the earliest sections. Archaeology suggests these lists serve political and cultural purposes, linking the present to a structured past. The evidence we do have points to people in these cities caring intensely about legitimacy, about who came first, about who had the right to rule. One interpretation is that the king lists are less about perfect historical accuracy and more about creating a coherent narrative of authority. A more cautious explanation could be that they blend memory, myth, propaganda, and occasional real chronologies stitched together by scribes who valued order. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the lists are not only telling you who ruled, but teaching you what time is supposed to feel like? Not messy, not uncertain, but arranged, numbered, and watchable. You run your eyes across the names, and the mind does what it always does with lists. It searches for patterns, repeated titles, certain cities showing up again, the way certain reigns seem normal and others seem impossibly vast. Historians still argue whether the extreme reign lengths in early king lists should be read as symbolic numerology, mythic time or corrupted tradition, rather than literal calendar years. There's no full consensus, but many scholars propose that the earliest sections function as a mythic prelude that gradually transitions into more historically plausible records. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The king list is real as a document and valuable as a window into how people thought about authority and continuity, but it doesn't automatically mean every number is a literal historical measurement. That's a possibility, not a certainty. And most mainstream readings treat the earliest giant reigns with caution. Now, because you're human, the mist creeps in anyway softly, like it belongs here. A fringe idea proposes that the king list's long reigns reflect non-human lifespans, or rulers who were not fully human remembered through later scribal tradition. A popular rumour claims that the before the flood rulers were connected to sky beings, and that the numbers encode an extraordinary truth. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it feels like a secret decoder ring. If the numbers are literal, then the past becomes inhabited by beings beyond normal human limits. To be clear, this is debated. The mainstream explanation can account for long reigns through symbolic math-mythic storytelling and cultural emphasis on grandeur without assuming literal immortal rulers. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea becomes a mood you can hold for a moment, like fog you watch from a warm window. You stay on the solid ground political storytelling. Most historians agree that rulers used claims of divine favour to strengthen their rule. Archaeology suggests king-sponsored temple-building festivals and inscriptions that praise themselves and their gods. The evidence we do have points to a feedback loop. The king honours the god chooses the king, and the city is supposed to feel reassured. One interpretation is that this loop also makes the divine world feel like an active political actor, because it is constantly invoked as justification. You can almost hear the ancient equivalent of a press release. The god has chosen me. It's a line that ages well because it's hard to fact check in court. You move through the scribal space and see another tablet. This one more narrative. It describes a ruler, a city, a struggle. Not graphic, not gory, just the usual. Ancient theme, someone wants something someone else resists. And a god's name is called like a legal signature. Archaeology suggests Mesopotamian literature includes epic-like narratives and royal inscriptions that blur the line between history and myth. What's broadly accepted is that these texts aren't modern journalism. They are purpose-built storytelling that mixes memory and meaning. A careful reading might suggest that when a text says a god placed kingship in a city, it could mean that political power shifted there and the story gave that shift a cosmic reason. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if kingship descended from heaven is not meant to be a literal meteor of authority landing in a courtyard, but a way to say this system is older than any one person and you are expected to accept it? Historians still argue whether early kingship emerged primarily as military leadership, religious stewardship, or economic management. There's no full consensus, and the answer may change depending on city and era. But what's broadly accepted is that the role of king became central, and writing became one of the king's sharpest tools. Now the reed stylus returns not as a humble tool, but as a weapon of permanence. Whoever controls the records controls the story of legitimacy. Whoever controls legitimacy controls obedience. You imagine a scene, a dispute in a courtyard, two families arguing over land. A scribe appears calm and tired, carrying a tablet. The scribe reads out what was recorded. The argument ends not because anyone is happy, but because the clay has spoken. The evidence we do have points to writing being used for law and administration, and that gives it a kind of authority that can feel almost supernatural. One interpretation is that this supernatural feeling is part of why divine language and bureaucratic language mingle so easily in these texts. The system is invisible, but it decides your rations, your labour, your boundaries. In your own time, you might call it the state or the market. In this world, you might call it the gods, because gods are the names you give to forces larger than you. A fringe idea proposes that the divine hierarchy described in some texts is not only metaphor, but a memory of an organised visiting group with ranks and roles reflected in titles. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it echoes the same appeal, a structured explanation for the structured world. To be clear, this is debated and the evidence remains interpretive. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. You step outside again, and the night air feels like relief. The temple silhouette is still there, massive and patient. The canal smell drifts in faintly. Somewhere a donkey brays, offended by something only a donkey understands. You look up at the stars. They feel unchanged, and that's comforting. Yet you notice how easily your mind wants to connect them to the lists and names you just saw. Names, numbers, sequences. The human urge to map the sky and map time is the same urge. Archaeology suggests Mesopotamians developed increasingly sophisticated ways to track time and celestial patterns over later periods, and that earlier traditions laid foundations for that. What's broadly accepted is that timekeeping and governance often grow together because rulers want calendars and taxes want schedules. One interpretation is that mythic time in king lists served as a bridge between cosmic order and political order. And what if in the calm imagination lane, those immense reigns are like constellations, not meant to be walked through as literal distance, but meant to be looked at to make you feel the weight of the past? Historians still argue whether the king list should be read as a single coherent tradition or as a patchwork compiled from local lists and agendas. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is part of the charm. The past is not one clean scroll. It's a stack of tablets, some cracked, some missing corners, some written over. You pause and you feel the day's motifs settle into place. Water as flow temple, as machine king list, as time made political. And somewhere within that structure, the word Anunnaki waits not yet, fully pressed into the centre of your attention, but hovering at the edge like a star you keep glancing at because it seems slightly too bright. You keep walking, and the city begins to feel less like a maze and more like a set of overlapping worlds. One world smells of bread and smoke and sleeping bodies. Another world smells of damp clay and inkless writing. Another world still is the temple's slow hum of authority. And above all of it, the sky sits like a lid of velvet, studded with cold points of light. You find yourself drawn toward a small open space where people gather, not in a festival crowd, but in the quiet way people gather when they're waiting for the morning to do something heavy. A few figures sit near a low fire. Someone stirs embers with a stick. The glow is soft and the shadows make everyone look older. Most historians agree that daily life in Sumer involved tightly organised labour, household routines, and community ties shaped by the demands of farming and urban work. Archaeology suggests people lived in mud brick homes, clustered along narrow streets, and that craft and trade were woven into the rhythm of the city. The evidence we do have points to a society where survival depended on cooperation, but where status and hierarchy were always present like an extra person in the room. You settle near the edge of the firelight, not fully joining, not fully leaving. It feels like the right posture for tonight, close enough to hear the story, far enough to keep your own mind clear. Someone begins to speak quietly, as if they're telling a child a story that isn't supposed to become a public argument. The words are not a modern script. They're more like fragments, names of gods, cities, decisions, punishments, blessings. You catch the repeated notion of those above and those below, and you feel your attention tighten. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion described a complex divine world with different categories of gods, spirits and cosmic roles. Archaeology suggests these beliefs were expressed in hymns, myths, and ritual practices, and that the divine hierarchy could be linked to city identity and political order. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where the universe is structured like a city gates, assemblies, ranks, decrees. One interpretation is that when people spoke of gods as if they were officials, it reflected how they experienced human institutions, A careful reading might suggest that the divine assembly mirrors the city's own council and administrative structure. A more cautious explanation could be that humans naturally anthropomorphize cosmic forces, giving storms harvests, and fate the personalities of leaders. And yet, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the language is deliberately crafted to feel like governance? Because governance is the strongest metaphor they had. Now the word you've been circling begins to come into focus, Anunnaki. Most historians agree that Anunnaki appears in Mesopotamian texts as a designation connected to a group of deities often linked to the underworld or to divine assemblies, depending on period and context. Archaeology suggests the term is not always used consistently across time, and that later traditions and translations can shift how modern readers understand it. The evidence we do have points to a key problem. One word can carry multiple shades of meaning, and when you pull it into a modern spotlight, the shadows change shape. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were originally imagined primarily as celestial gods, as chthonic or underworld-associated gods, or as a flexible label for certain divine ranks that changed across regions and eras. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is part of why the term feels mysterious to modern ears. You listen to the speaker by the fire and you notice how the word lands. It's not spoken like a scary secret. It's spoken like a known category, like saying the elders or the judges or the people who decide things when you're not invited. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki represent the concept of a divine authority group, the kind that issues decrees and stands behind the visible gods people address in daily prayers. A more cautious explanation could be that the term's function depends entirely on the text and the era, and that modern attempts to turn it into a single stable identity may oversimplify. Still, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the fact that the word shifts is itself the clue, suggesting that the term is more like a title than a species, more like a role than a face? You glance at the fire and the sparks lift upward, for a moment tiny, bright and gone. It's hard not to think of coming down and rising up when you watch fire. It trains your imagination. Now gently the mist layer enters labelled and careful. A fringe idea proposes that Anunnaki refers to literal beings who arrive from the sky, and that ancient texts preserve memories of contact events framed as religious narrative. A popular rumour claims that these beings came to Earth altering human development, and that the stories are encoded historical reports. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it spreads because it feels like it gives the past a single dramatic key. To be clear, this is debated. Mainstream scholarship generally treats the Anunnaki as divine figures within a religious and literary tradition, not confirmed extraterrestrial visitors. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's documented that people wrote about gods and divine groups, and it's documented that the word Anunnaki appears, but interpreting that as literal alien arrival is a possibility some imagine, not a conclusion supported by broad archaeological evidence. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, you consider how stories work in a city like this. When labour is hard and the environment is unpredictable, stories don't just entertain, They stabilize. They offer a reason the world is the way it is. They teach what to fear, what to respect, what to hope for. Archaeology suggests that mythic narratives often encode social values and cosmological explanations. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths explore themes like order versus chaos, the limits of human power, the responsibilities of rulers, and the tensions between cities and gods. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki as a divine group might serve as a symbol for the deep impersonal layer of fate and authority. A careful reading might suggest they stand behind the scenes less emotional than the gods who get personal stories, more like the system of the universe. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Anunnaki are not meant to be pictured clearly, because the deepest forces in life are rarely pictured clearly? You can name them, but you can't hold them. You feel the night deepen and your body starts to slow. That's the sleep-friendly spell of firelight. It turns time into something thicker. You hear another fragment the speaker mentions, an assembly, a gathering of gods making decisions. The idea of an assembly makes you think of the temple, the lists, the ration tablets, the king list. Everything in this world is an assembly. Even the sky feels assembled. Most historians agree that divine councils appear in many ancient traditions, including Mesopotamian literature reflecting hierarchical cosmologies. Archaeology suggests that such concepts were reinforced through ritual and institutional life. The evidence we do have points to humans projecting their governance onto the cosmos, and then letting the cosmos justify their governance. It's a loop that never really went away. It just got new names and better lighting. You can't help a small joke drifting through your mind. If the Anunnaki were a council, you'd still have to fill out the proper forms to speak. Please submit your prayer in triplicate, one copy for the underworld. But the humour fades into a quieter thought. If a word can shift meaning over centuries, then what you're hearing tonight is not a single message, but a layered echo. A careful reading might suggest that when modern people say Anunnaki came to Earth, they may be mixing different textual traditions, later interpretations, and modern storytelling hunger. A more cautious explanation could be that the ancient term is being pulled into a narrative it never fully carried. Historians still argue whether later retellings and modern translations have amplified certain aspects of Mesopotamian mythology while flattening others, making some terms seem more exotic or more literal than they were in their original contexts. There's no full consensus, but the debate itself is a reminder you're walking through a landscape of words, not a single filmed event. You rise from the edge of the firelight and continue onward, carrying the term Anunnaki more clearly now, but also more gently. It's not a smoking gun, it's a signpost in a foggy field. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And as you move through the sleeping city, you feel the temple's silhouette, watching from afar. The canals breathing in the dark, and the invisible scribes of time, pressing their wedges into clay, leaving you with an open question rather than a final answer. You carry the word Anunnaki the way you carry a fragile bowl, carefully, because it's easy to spill meaning all over the floor. The firelight from the small gathering fades behind you, and the city returns to its quieter nighttime rhythm. A breeze slides through the streets, brushing your skin and cooling the sweat at the back of your neck. Somewhere a simple fan does not exist yet, but you can almost hear one anyway, a soft background hum. Your modern mind keeps trying to donate to the scene. You pass a doorway where a lamp burns low. The light catches a stack of clay tablets near the entrance, tucked away like a secret, though it might just be storage. You slow down because your body has learned a new instinct tonight. If there are tablets, there are clues. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian divine names and roles evolved over long spans of time, shifting with politics, city prominence, and changing ritual traditions. Archaeology suggests texts come from different places and eras, and that scribes copied, edited, and adapted older material to fit new needs. The evidence we do have points to a simple truth that makes everything more complicated. The ancient world was not one voice. It was many voices layered on top of each other like plaster on a wall. You step into a small scribal space, again smaller than the earlier room, more like a corner office for someone who cannot stop working. A reed stylus rests near a lump of clay. The smell of damp earth is calm and familiar now, like you've been here all week. You can almost feel the texture of the wedges under your fingertips without even touching them. One interpretation is that names in these texts are less like fixed labels and more like living titles, and that divine names often carried multiple functions depending on context. A careful reading might suggest that when a god appears in one city as a patron of fertility, and in another context as an enforcer of order, it doesn't mean the story is inconsistent. It may mean the society is. A more cautious explanation could be that different local traditions merged and scribes harmonized them the best they could, creating a layered system that only looks tidy from far away. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the shifting meanings are not a flaw, but the message showing you how humans reshape the sky to match their ground? You find a tablet that mentions a divine group, but the tone feels formal, almost bureaucratic. Not the kind of text that tries to stir your emotions. It reads like a category list, like someone organising an invisible hierarchy. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion included many gods with overlapping spheres of influence, and that terms for divine groups could vary in meaning across time. Archaeology suggests that later periods often systematized earlier traditions, especially as large states and empires absorbed many local cults. The evidence we do have points to religion behaving like language. It spreads, it borrows, it changes, pronunciation, and then one day someone insists the correct version was always the current one. You think about your own time and how words shift. One decade's slang becomes the next decade's cringe. The ancient version is just slower and written in clay instead of memes. Now you return to Anunnaki and you hold it up to the lamplight the way you hold a tablet up to see the wedges cast shadow. The term itself is old and its usage is not always the same from text to text. Historians still argue whether Anunnaki functioned as a consistent, well-defined group across the whole span of Mesopotamian history, or whether the term shifted in meaning depending on period, region, and literary genre. That debate is your anchor because it keeps you honest. It reminds you that even when a word sounds like a single thing, it might be many things wearing one name. Most historians agree that many Mesopotamian texts were preserved through copying, and that scribes could modify language to suit new audiences. Archaeology suggests scribal schools trained writers in standard phrases and traditional compositions which could stabilize some forms while also allowing slow drift. The evidence we do have points to a world where the past is curated, not simply recorded. One interpretation is that divine group names, including Anunnaki, may have been used as flexible shorthand for authority in the divine realm, especially in contexts involving decrees, destiny, and cosmic order. A more cautious explanation could be that modern readers sometimes expect mythic categories to behave like scientific categories, and ancient religion just does not work that way. It's closer to poetry than taxonomy. You can almost picture an exhausted scribe hearing a student ask, very earnestly, "So who exactly are the Anunnaki?" Like, make a list, and the scribe sighing into his hands, because the universe is not going to fit neatly into bullet points. And yet, here you are doing exactly that, because you are also human, and humans love lists, especially at night when they feel like ladders out of uncertainty. Now gently the mist layer returns labelled and careful. A fringe idea proposes that if the term Anunnaki shifts, it might be because scribes were trying to preserve descriptions of something unusual while adapting them to changing religious frameworks. A popular rumour claims that the very inconsistency is evidence of a covered event, with details blurred over time. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals to the modern appetite for hidden patterns. To be clear, this is debated and the evidence remains interpretive rather than conclusive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mood for wondering, not a claim that history has been secretly solved. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Shifting terminology is common in long-lived cultures, and the mainstream explanation for it is cultural evolution, not confirmed contact with non-human visitors. Still, the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and that gap is where speculation likes to camp out with a thermos. You turn back to the solid ground and keep walking through the scribal corner. You notice a few different tablets, and their variety is the point. A hymn uses lofty language, the kind that makes the gods feel tall. An administrative list uses dry language, the kind that makes the gods feel like departments. A ritual instruction text uses precise steps, the kind that makes the gods feel like a schedule you do not want to miss. Most historians agree that different genres of text have different purposes, and that meaning changes with purpose. Archaeology suggests that even when the same divine name appears, its role can vary depending on whether the text is a prayer, a myth, a legal record, or a ritual directive. The evidence we do have points to a common sense rule. If you read everything as literal reporting, you will trip over metaphor. If you read everything as pure metaphor, you may miss how seriously people treated these stories. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki may sometimes appear as a dramatic backdrop a way to describe the highest level of decision-making in the cosmos. A more cautious explanation could be that the term's associations with the underworld in some contexts reflect a specific theological framework rather than a universal identity. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if underworld language is not about a place beneath your feet, but about the hidden layer of existence, the part that controls outcomes while remaining unseen? You step out of the scribal corner and back into the street. The night is calm. A distant dog huffs once, then settles. The city smells like warm brick cooling after a hot day. Your breathing slows the way it does when the world stops demanding answers every second. You think about how names become magnets. In your modern world, a name can gather theories, rumours, and certainty-sounding phrases that feel persuasive but aren't careful. Here the name Anunnaki has become such a magnet for modern imagination. It sticks to documentaries, forums, late-night conversations, and the part of your brain that loves a hidden door. Most historians agree that modern retellings can reshape ancient material, emphasizing certain elements and downplaying others. Archaeology suggests that without context, a translated term can take on a life of its own, especially when separated from the larger web of Mesopotamian theology. The evidence we do have points to the need for slow reading the kind you're doing tonight. One interpretation is that the healthiest way to hold the word Anunnaki is as an evolving religious category, sometimes connected to divine assemblies, sometimes to underworld authority, sometimes to a poetic sense of high-ranking divinity. A more cautious explanation could be that each occurrence should be read within its specific text and period, and that sweeping statements are risky. Now, one last small imaginative what if kept gentle. What if the reason the word feels slippery is because it was meant to be? What if it functioned like a curtain, letting you sense a presence without forcing a single image? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You touch the reed stylus in your mind again, that small tool that presses order into clay. The stylus does not care what you believe. It only cares that you press the wedge cleanly, that you keep the line straight, that you leave something behind. And you realise the Anunnaki, in the most sleep-friendly sense, might be like the stylus itself, not a monster, not a certainty, but a shape that helps humans talk about power, fate, and the invisible structure of the world. You keep walking slow and steady, letting the city's quiet do what it does best. It calms you while it questions you. You keep moving through the city as if you're walking across a living manuscript each street, another line pressed into the night. The air feels softer now, warmer where walls hold the day's heat cooler, where alleys open to the river breeze. A lamp flickers behind a reed screen. Someone coughs in their sleep. The whole place seems to hum with quiet work, even when most bodies are resting, because in a city built on schedules, rest is just another assigned task. You find a doorway where voices are low and steady, not chanting this time, not administrative counting either, but the intimate rhythm of storytelling. You pause at the edge, polite in that universal way humans have when they want to listen without being asked to contribute. Inside you hear a creation story or something close to it. Words about beginning, about shaping, about making. The tone is neither playful nor terrifying. It's practical the way a person talks when they are explaining why the world is the way it is and why you should probably stop complaining and go do your part. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cultures produced multiple creation and origin narratives, and that these myths often reflect social realities alongside religious ideas. Archaeology suggests such stories were written down in different forms over time, sometimes preserved in tablets that survive as fragments rather than perfect scripts. The evidence we do have points to a shared theme. Humans are not created merely to admire sunsets. Humans are created to work to maintain order, to keep the system running, to keep the gods' world and the human world from falling into messy chaos. One interpretation is that these stories serve as a cosmic job description, a divine way of saying, here's why you're tired. A more cautious explanation could be that they're teaching myths used to explain labour, suffering, and the structure of society in a way that feels meaningful. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if creation in these texts is not only about the first moment, but about the ongoing act of keeping civilization alive, day after day, canal after canal, bowl of barley after bowl of barley? You listen closer and you notice how the story uses materials: clay, water, breath. These aren't random symbols here. They're the literal ingredients of daily life. Mud brick walls, clay tablets, river water, human lungs breathing through heat and dust. Archaeology suggests that clay was everywhere in Mesopotamia, a basic resource for building and writing. What's broadly accepted is that people used what they had, and what they had was mud. A careful reading might suggest that when a story says humans were shaped from clay, it's both a poetic image and a statement of intimacy. You are made of the same substance as your world, and therefore you belong to its rules. You feel your fingers itch to pick up a lump of clay again, to press a mark into it, to participate in the oldest human urge to leave proof you were here. But tonight you're not proving anything. You're following clues. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths often portray gods as powerful, but not always gentle, concerned with maintaining cosmic order and their own comfort. The evidence we do have points to a world where divine beings are not purely moral heroes. They're administrators of existence, sometimes noble, sometimes petty, sometimes deeply relatable in the most inconvenient ways. If you've ever watched someone in a position of authority get annoyed because the meeting went long, you already understand at least one flavour of ancient god. One interpretation is that the gods in these creation stories reflect human institutions, hierarchy, division of labour, bureaucracy. A more cautious explanation could be that the gods are literary devices to discuss the realities of leadership and responsibility. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the gods are also a way to talk about forces humans couldn't control, like drought, flood, disease, and the constant risk that everything you built from mud might return to mud? Now, because this is where the modern imagination loves to leap, you reach the threshold where the Anunnaki sometimes entered the conversation again. not as a spaceship crew in the mainstream view, but as part of a wider divine world where groups and ranks matter. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian stories describe divine decisions that shape human purpose, and that humans often appear as labourers maintaining the order of the world, including temples and offerings. Archaeology suggests many texts emphasize ritual duty and the maintenance of sacred spaces. The evidence we do have points to a cultural reality. Someone had to do the work, and the work needed justification strong enough to keep people doing it through heat and hardship. Historians still argue whether these creation narratives should be read primarily as theology, as political ideology that reinforced social hierarchy, or as cultural psychology that gave meaning to labour and suffering. That debate is not a weakness. It's a sign of honesty. It reminds you that a myth can do more than one job at the same time, like a tool that's also a symbol. You let the story wash over you, slow as a canal current. The speaker's voice dips and rises, and you start noticing which parts feel most human. The gods hold councils. They worry about noise. They assign tasks. They enforce boundaries. It's almost like listening to a family trying to organise a household, except the household is the entire universe, and the chores involve keeping the sun from falling into the sea. You can't help a small joke sliding into your mind. If the gods created humans for labour, then somewhere in the divine paperwork there's a line that reads, "Position Earth Maintenance Intern, benefits occasional festivals." And you know what? That's not even the worst job posting you've ever seen. At least the commute is short. You're already on Earth. Most historians agree that ancient societies often explained social roles through sacred stories, and that myths helped normalize inequality by framing it as part of cosmic order. The evidence we do have points to temples and kingship being supported by narratives of divine favour and divine decree. One interpretation is that when myths say humans were made to serve the gods, it may also imply humans are meant to serve the institutions that represent the gods. A more cautious explanation could be that these stories provided psychological comfort, turning hard labour into meaningful duty rather than pointless struggle. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the true tension in these texts is not humans are made to serve, but humans are caught between necessity and dignity, trying to find a way to feel valued even when the work is heavy? You step back from the doorway and let your feet move again because you can feel your mind getting too awake, and that is not the goal tonight. You want the story to cradle you, not activate your entire nervous system like a loud notification. The street opens into a small area where a few workers are sleeping near their tools, the way people do when home is far or when dawn comes too quickly. You see a shovel-like implement, a basket, a coil of rope, ordinary things. And yet you realise how much mythology is about ordinary things made cosmic. Archaeology suggests that labour in Mesopotamia included farming, canal maintenance, construction, craft production, and temple service, often organised through institutions that distributed rations. What's broadly accepted is that work was not optional if you wanted to eat. One interpretation is that a creation story that frames labour as divine purpose can stabilize a community by making necessity feel like destiny. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply the human habit of storytelling. We turn the unavoidable into a narrative because narrative makes it bearable. Now the mist layer, carefully labelled, arrives for a brief visit. A fringe idea proposes that when myths describe humans being made for work or service, it might reflect a literal intervention by advanced beings who shape society for their own purposes. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki engineered humanity as labourers, and that the myths are disguised history. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin from a mainstream archaeological perspective. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic lens, not a fact claim, and will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Creation myths can sound literal when read with modern expectations, but they are often symbolic, multi-layered, and shaped by social context. The mainstream view generally reads them as mythic explanations of human life, not laboratory notes from a cosmic visitor. You keep walking. The night air tastes faintly of ash and grain. A dog shifts in its sleep and thumps its tail once, as if approving your decision to remain calm. You pass a low wall and see a small clay figurine tucked in a corner, maybe protective, maybe decorative, maybe just someone's quiet comfort object. You think about how people then and now place tiny symbols around themselves to feel safe. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian peoples used amulets and ritual objects in daily life, reflecting a worldview where unseen forces mattered. Archaeology suggests household religion and personal devotion existed alongside temple worship. One interpretation is that creation stories are not only public ideology, but personal reassurance. You are part of a story, you are not random dust. A more cautious explanation could be that this reassurance is precisely why myths endure. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the most important message in these creation narratives is not who made you, but that you are seen, counted and named even in a vast world of rivers and stars? You feel your shoulders drop. The city's edges soften. The creation story doesn't demand you solve it. It simply offers a frame, a way to hold life without it spilling everywhere. And in the distance, the temple silhouette remains steady as ever, like a reminder that in this world, work and worship are often the same road, and you are walking it one slow step at a time. You keep walking until the city thins a little, until the walls step farther apart, and the night air smells less like hearth smoke and more like open mud. The ground under your feet feels softer here, as if it never fully dries, as if it remembers being riverbed. You can hear water again, not the tidy canal flow you followed earlier, but something broader and less obedient, a slow slosh in the distance that makes your mind picture dark currents moving through reeds. The reed motif returns in the most literal way. You brush past a stand of tall stalks, and they whisper against each other with a dry, papery sound. In the dimness, they look like a crowd standing very still. You pause, and in that pause you feel the oldest kind of unease, the kind that doesn't come from monsters but from weather. Most historians agree that the floodplain environment of southern Mesopotamia could be both generous and dangerous, with water that fed fields also capable of destroying homes and harvests. Archaeology suggests there were real floods and flood layers at certain sites, and that people built, rebuilt, and adapted to a landscape that could change its mind. The evidence we do have points to a practical reality. A city on a river is always negotiating with a force that doesn't sign agreements. One interpretation is that the great flood stories in Mesopotamian tradition preserve echoes of real disasters filtered through memory and ritual, then turned into narrative that could travel across generations. A more cautious explanation could be that flood myths are also common motifs in many cultures shaped by symbolism, and storytelling needs not only direct historical reporting. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if flood memory is the place where the line between documented experience and imagined meaning becomes especially thin because trauma blurs into myth so easily? You step closer to a low-lying area where the ground dips. Even at night you can sense the shape of it. This is where water would gather first if it rose. The air is cooler and the stars feel farther away, as if the sky is lifting its feet to avoid the wet. You think about how people must have talked about floods here. Not as a rare headline, but as a possibility that lived in the background like a permanent rumour. The kind of rumour you don't even argue with. You just keep an eye on the horizon. Archaeology suggests that some ancient settlements show evidence of flood deposits, and that rebuilding after flood events was part of life in the region. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian communities developed practical responses, embankments, canals drainage, elevated platforms, and the constant labour of maintenance. One interpretation is that this relentless maintenance shaped the moral language of the culture, where order is fragile and must be actively upheld. A careful reading might suggest that when myths talk about chaos threatening to return, the imagery is not abstract, it's water. And if you're the kind of person who likes a small joke, before sleep, here it is. You can feel sympathy for the ancient person assigned to Canal Maintenance Day, because that job has never been glamorous in any century. It's basically the same role today, just with more reflective vests and fewer gods being blamed for the blockage. As you move, the ground becomes firmer again, and you find a small raised area where someone has left a simple marker, maybe a post or a pile of stones. It might mean nothing. It might mark a boundary. It might be the place where a memory happened. In this world, memory often lives in objects, because the landscape itself keeps getting rewritten by water. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature includes flood narratives that later influenced and echoed through other traditions. The evidence we do have points to stories that describe warning preparation, catastrophe survival, and renewal. One interpretation is that these stories serve as moral drama. Humans fail gods, decide a remnant survives, and order returns. A more cautious explanation could be that these texts function as cultural reassurance, a way to say even when water takes everything, life can begin again. Historians still argue whether the most famous Mesopotamian flood narratives are primarily rooted in specific historical flood events at particular cities, or whether they are mythic compositions that absorb many smaller disasters into one grand story. That debate matters because it keeps you from turning story into certainty. It lets you hold the flood as both a real experience and a symbolic stage. You notice your hands are damp and you realise you've been absent-mindedly touching the reeds as you pass. Reeds hold water on their surfaces like tiny beads, and now the beads cling to your fingertips. It's a small sensory detail, but it pulls you deeper into the scene. The flood is not a concept. It's cold on your skin. What's broadly accepted is that people in this region built with mud brick and floodwater have a relationship that is not friendly. One interpretation is that the fragility of building materials intensifies the emotional power of flood stories. A more cautious explanation could be that dramatic narrative naturally focuses on the most destructive threat in a given environment. And what if, in the calm imagination lane, you picture a night when the river rose higher than anyone expected, when lamps went out one by one and the city's normal sounds were replaced by rushing and shouting, and the helpless scrape of objects floating where they shouldn't. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Now here comes the quirky edge of the night, the little tidbit that makes your brain perk up, even though you promised it you would be sleepy. There are stories repeated in modern conversations that claim ancient flood accounts include hidden maps, coded star alignments, or technical details that suggest something beyond myth. A fringe idea proposes that flood narratives preserve not only disaster memory, but also a warning from a more advanced source, a kind of cosmic memo left in story form. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it sticks around because it makes the flood feel like a message, not just an event. To be clear, this is debated, and mainstream readings do not treat flood myths as technical instruction manuals from visitors. A more cautious explanation could be that humans naturally weave meaning into catastrophe, and the bigger the catastrophe, the more meaning people try to extract from it. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic way to wonder, not a claim that we've uncovered a hidden truth. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The flood stories are powerful, regardless of whether they encode anything unusual. Their power comes from the fact that they describe what it feels like when the world you know becomes water. You keep walking and the city begins to reappear in the distance, a low dark shape against the stars. You can smell smoke, again faint and comforting. You also smell something else, wet silt, the scent of riverbed, earthy and old. Your mind starts to stitch together the night's motifs as if it's trying to make a quilt. Reeds, canals, temple lists, king names, divine councils, and now flood memory. Archaeology suggests that after floods, communities rebuilt sometimes on the same spot, sometimes slightly shifted, raising ground levels over time. What's broadly accepted is that the landscape of ancient cities is layered with new floors built atop old debris. One interpretation is that this physical layering shaped the way people imagined time, not as a straight line, but as stacked surfaces. A careful reading might suggest that flood myths are a narrative version of that stacking, a deep layer of fear, covered by a layer of survival, covered by a layer of ceremony, covered by a layer of text. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the flood is also a metaphor for forgetting? Water comes, erases, smooths, and when it recedes, people rebuild and pretend the old lines were never there. That's not a certainty, it's a possibility, but it feels emotionally true. You pass a small work area where tools are stored and your sleepy brain offers you another gentle joke. The real hero of flood season is not a king or a god, it's the person who remembers where the rope is. In every civilization there's always someone saying, "I told you we should have kept the rope by the door," and they are always right. The reed stylus motif returns in your mind, and you imagine a scribe after a flood, clay still, wet, hands trembling, pressing wedges into a tablet to record what was lost and what was saved. The evidence we do have points to writing being used for practical matters, including property and distribution. And it's easy to imagine that after disaster, the need for records becomes even sharper. One interpretation is that flood narratives and administrative records are two sides of the same survival instinct. One makes the disaster meaningful, the other makes recovery possible. A more cautious explanation could be that they simply coexisted in a society where both story and logistics mattered. And what if, in the most calming reading, the Great Flood story is not about the end, but about continuity? Water comes, water leaves. People press their marks into clay again. You slow down, letting the rhythm of your steps match the imagined river's steady movement. The city's lights are few and gentle. The night is large. The flood, whether literal memory, symbolic drama, or both, becomes a soft shadow in the background of your mind, reminding you that even in the oldest stories, survival is usually quieter than catastrophe. You return from the river's darker edges to the city's steadier shape, and it feels like stepping from a restless dream into a calmer one. The air is warmer again. Smoke threads through the streets in faint ribbons. Somewhere a late lamp still burns, not because someone is dramatic, but because someone is working. In this world, sleep is a luxury, and waking is often a duty. You look up, and the stars seem sharper here, framed by walls and rooftops. The strip of sky above the street looks like a narrow river of light. Your body slows almost automatically, like it recognizes that the heavens are part of tonight's path now. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian peoples paid close attention to the sky using celestial patterns to track seasons, plan agricultural cycles, and support ritual calendars. Archaeology suggests that over time, this attention developed into more formal astronomical and astrological traditions in Mesopotamia. The evidence we do have points to an early steady habit of watching the heavens not as entertainment, but as survival math. One interpretation is that sky watching makes the cosmos feel intimate, like a neighbour whose habits you learn over years. A more cautious explanation could be that people simply needed reliable seasonal markers and used the most consistent clock they had, the sky. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the very act of watching the heavens night after night made the idea of visitors feel plausible because the sky stopped being an abstract ceiling and became a busy road? You follow a street that leads toward an open courtyard. In the centre there's a low platform and a shallow bowl of water, maybe for ritual, maybe for practical use, maybe both. The water reflects the stars with a trembling clarity. You lean over and see a tiny constellation shiver in the bowl, like the universe fits into your hands if you hold them steady enough. What's broadly accepted is that water surfaces can be used for reflection, and that ancient peoples sometimes used simple observational methods long before formal instruments. Archaeology suggests that careful observation did not require advanced technology, only patience and repetition. The evidence we do have points to a kind of slow science look: remember, compare, repeat. A careful reading might suggest that many early sky-related texts are not about fantastical beings at all, but about cataloguing patterns, tracking cycles, and connecting them to ritual timing. One interpretation is that when a myth says a god moves in the heavens, it may reflect the movement of a planet or star given personality through story. A more cautious explanation could be that religious language served as the cultural framework for observation. And what if in the calm imagination lane you picture a young apprentice looking up, noticing a star that wasn't there last season, and feeling the same quiet thrill you feel when you notice something new in a familiar sky? You straighten and keep walking. A distant drumbeat is gone now. No temple chant, just the quiet scrape of sandals, your own breath, and the occasional soft call of someone still awake. You approach a small room where a few people sit with tablets. These are not ration lists tonight. These tablets seem to carry short notations, repeated marks, small symbols that look like they want to be a record of timing. A person points upward, then presses a mark, then points again, as if turning the sky into a schedule. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cultures developed calendar systems tied to lunar cycles, and that religious festivals often depended on accurate timing. Archaeology suggests that scribes and priests played roles in maintaining these calendars. The evidence we do have points to timekeeping being both sacred and practical, because crops do not wait for your philosophy. Historians still argue whether early Mesopotamian sky observations were primarily driven by agricultural needs, by ritual requirements, by political authority, seeking omen legitimacy, or by a genuine curiosity that we might call proto-scientific. That debate matters because it reminds you that motives can overlap. People can be curious and practical and superstitious and strategic all at once. Honestly, so can you. You can learn astronomy because you love the sky, and also because you want to sound impressive at a party. Both can be true. One interpretation is that the sky served as a public authority. If the moon's phase determined a festival date, then the sky itself became a kind of supervisor. A more cautious explanation could be that celestial regularity simply offered a reliable reference point. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the sense of cosmic supervision helped communities feel less alone, as if the universe was paying attention to their schedules? Now, as you stand in this room of quiet watchers, you understand how easily the language of descent and arrival could attach to sky events. A bright meteor streaks across the night, and someone says the heavens are speaking. A planet shines unusually bright, and someone says a god is near. A rare alignment happens, and everyone acts like a door has opened. Most historians agree that omen traditions in Mesopotamia often connected celestial phenomena to earthly events, interpreting the sky as a message-bearing system. Archaeology suggests such traditions became highly developed later with extensive omen compendia. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where signs are everywhere and the sky is the biggest signboard. One interpretation is that this sign-reading habit could make mythic language feel literal to people who lived inside it. A more cautious explanation could be that it was symbolic thinking applied consistently, not confusion about reality. And what if in gentle imagination you picture a night when an unusually slow moving bright object appeared and the city's watchers debated what it meant, their voices low, their hearts just a little faster. Now the mist layer, labelled and careful, steps in. A fringe idea proposes that ancient sky records may include descriptions of objects that do not fit normal celestial categories, and that some arrival language could preserve memories of unusual sightings. A popular rumour claims that an anomalous sky event was interpreted as beings coming down and later woven into the Anunnaki story. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin and often filtered through modern retelling. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a way to imagine how strange a sky can feel when you do not have modern explanations. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Unusual celestial events can be explained by natural phenomena in many cases, and mainstream scholarship does not treat Mesopotamian myth language as confirmed reports of extraterrestrial craft. Still, the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and ancient descriptions can be hard to translate into modern categories. You step back onto solid ground again. You look at the watchers and realize something: they are not naive. They are disciplined. They know the sky's usual habits. That means when something truly unusual happens, they notice. The evidence we do have points to careful observation being part of their culture. Most historians agree that the moon played a central role in Mesopotamian timekeeping, and that lunar months structured many calendars. Archaeology suggests that this required repeated observation and community agreement on timing. One interpretation is that this practice turned the sky into a shared public reference building social cohesion. A more cautious explanation could be that it was simply the most practical way to organise months. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the shared act of looking up created a shared emotional experience so that a community could feel unified under the same night? That feeling is powerful. It's still powerful today when a meteor shower happens and strangers stand together, pointing, smiling, speaking softly, like the sky is a temporary language everyone understands. You can't help one small joke slipping in because your modern brain is irreverent. The ancient skywatcher's version of checking your phone was basically craning your neck until it hurt and then pretending you're fine. No, I am not uncomfortable. I am communing with the cosmos. Sure you are. You look at the shallow bowl again. The stars reflect, tremble, and reform. The water is never still for long, even when the night is calm. The motif returns water reflection record. The scribes are pressing marks into clay while the sky writes its own repeating patterns above them. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki, in some contexts, may be linked to the broader sense of divine order that includes celestial regularity. A more cautious explanation could be that the term's associations vary, and connecting it directly to astronomy in early Sumer is risky without specific context. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Tonight we're staying careful. Still, you can feel why the modern imagination likes to connect them. Sky beings, divine councils coming down a civilization obsessed with observation. It's a strong aesthetic. It's a powerful mood. But the solid ground is simpler humans watched the sky because it mattered, and then they wrapped meaning around what they saw. Historians still argue whether the primary function of sky-related traditions was predictive power, ritual order, political control, or genuine curiosity, and the answer may be all of the above, depending on time and place. There's no full consensus, and your mind can rest in that. You leave the watchers to their quiet work. The courtyard opens back into the street. The stars above feel less like strangers now, and more like old neighbours. The kind you don't always understand, but you recognise. And as you walk, you keep one thought gently in your pocket. If a story says something came down from the sky, sometimes it's a metaphor for authority. Sometimes it's a poetic description of a real sky event. And sometimes, if you're honest, it's simply the human way of saying we saw something and we needed a story big enough to hold it. You leave the little room of watchers behind, and the city feels different now, as if you've learned its second language. Before you heard streets and walls and ovens. Now you hear patterns. You hear repetition. You hear the steady pulse of a society that measures time, measures grain measures, water measures, words. The stars still hang above you, quiet and sharp, but your attention shifts downward again, back toward the stories that travel between sky and earth like a slow elevator. You walk toward a familiar silhouette, not the main temple this time, but a smaller sacred building, the kind where a myth might be spoken softly rather than proclaimed loudly. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths often explore movement between realms, sky-earth and the underworld, with deities travelling, descending, ascending, and negotiating boundaries. Archaeology suggests these narratives were part of ritual life and scribal education, and that they carried social and psychological meaning. The evidence we do have points to humans being fascinated by thresholds, because thresholds are where rules blur. One interpretation is that descent motifs reflect the experience of losing and returning, the seasonal cycle drought, and recovery death, and memory political collapse and restoration. A more cautious explanation could be that these are literary devices that dramatize cosmic order. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if descent language is also a way to talk about hidden systems, the parts of life that affect you without being visible, like the way water moves underground before it surfaces again? You step into the smaller, sacred space. The air is different, cooler and heavier, with a faint smell of old smoke. A lamp burns low near the wall, and the light makes the corners look deeper than they should be. You slow down because you can feel the psychological gravity of the place. You hear a story being retold, not with theatrical excitement, but with the careful tone people use when they're repeating something important. It's a story about going down, about crossing boundaries, about learning the cost of certain knowledge. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian literature includes descent narratives, including myths associated with deities who travel to the underworld, and that these stories carry themes of power, vulnerability, and rule-bound cosmic order. Archaeology suggests such myths were copied and preserved by scribes, indicating they mattered enough to keep. The evidence we do have points to a consistent message. Some doors can be opened, but every opening comes with conditions. Historians still argue whether descent narratives were primarily ritual dramas tied to seasonal cycles, moral teachings about limits and consequences, or symbolic reflections of social hierarchy and political authority. That debate is a soft pillow for your mind. It means you don't have to force one meaning. You can let the story be layered, like the city's floors built over flood debris. You listen as the storyteller speaks of an underworld that is not fiery horror, not a gory nightmare, but a structured realm with rules, gates, and officials. The underworld feels like a bureaucracy of silence. If you've ever waited in a long line at an office where the lights flicker and nobody smiles, you already understand the mood. It's not terrifying, it's exhausting. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian underworld descriptions often emphasize inevitability and order rather than moral punishment in a later religious sense. The evidence we do have points to an underworld that is more like a shadowed continuation of existence than a moral courtroom. One interpretation is that this reflects a culture where cosmic order is about structure, not about reward. A more cautious explanation could be that underworld imagery varied across texts and periods. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if underworld language is also a metaphor for the parts of human life that happen beneath public view debt? Grief, labour, illness, quiet fear. The things that govern you without announcing themselves. Now the term Anunnaki hovers near the edge again because in some later contexts people associate this group with the underworld or with divine assemblies that influence fate. You hold this carefully. What's broadly accepted is that some Mesopotamian texts connect groups of deities to underworld authority and to the broader management of destiny, though usage and associations can vary by period and tradition. Archaeology suggests that theological systems were complex and evolved. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where cosmic administration is real in the imagination, and that administration includes realms beneath the visible world. One interpretation is that naming a group like the Anunnaki in an underworld context serves to emphasize ultimate authority, the deepest layer of decision-making. A more cautious explanation could be that the term's presence depends on the specific text and era, and modern readers can overgeneralize. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Tonight, we're staying careful with each step. Now, because modern audiences often hear descent and immediately picture literal arrival or departure, the mist layer comes in for a moment labelled and gentle. A fringe idea proposes that descent narratives preserve memories of literal beings moving between worlds, interpreted by ancient people as gods travelling. A popular rumour claims that the underworld is not metaphor, but a hidden physical domain or even a base. and that groups like the Anunnaki were stationed there. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it leans heavily on modern imagination rather than strong archaeological support. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes cinematic atmosphere, not a historical claim. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Descent stories are powerful literature and meaningful religious narrative, but mainstream scholarship does not treat them as documented travel logs of non-human visitors. The solid ground remains symbolic storytelling shaped by environment, politics, and ritual. You step back from the mist and return to what you can feel: the lamp's heat, the smoke in your throat, the hush of the room. You notice the storyteller's cadence, how it slows at certain lines, how it lingers near the gates, how it emphasizes rules. This is not just entertainment, it's training. It teaches you to respect boundaries. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths often include lists and sequences, gates, names, items, steps, decrees. Archaeology suggests scribal culture valued ordered structure. The evidence we do have points to a society that found comfort in sequence, because sequence makes chaos manageable. One interpretation is that descent myths mirror the structure of real institutions. You pass gates, you submit offerings, you follow protocols, you accept limits. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply the human habit of narrating the unknown using known social forms. And what if, in gentle imagination, you picture a person who has lost someone listening to this story and feeling a strange comfort? The underworld has rules, therefore the loss is not random. The mind clings to rules when grief tries to dissolve everything. You feel your eyelids grow heavy and you welcome it. This is the moment when a story becomes a lullaby, when your nervous system stops asking for a final answer and starts accepting quiet structure. You step out into the street again. The stars above still look like distant watchers. The city below still breathes. You can hear a faint canal trickle somewhere, and you realize the descent motif isn't only in myth. It's in water, in gravity, in the way your body settles when it's tired. Historians still argue whether the most enduring power of descent narratives lies in their ritual function, their psychological resonance, or their political symbolism. There's no full consensus, and that's fine. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You keep walking, and the underworld remains behind you like a shadow. You don't have to fear. It's just another layer of the city's imagination. Another way of saying that life has depth. And you carry that depth forward because soon you'll follow another path, one that leads not down but outward, toward trade routes and strange objects that make stories feel sharper. For now, you let the night hold you. You let the descent motif settle into your mind like a quiet stone, sinking into water, leaving only gentle ripples on the surface. You keep walking, and the city's sacred hush starts to loosen its grip. The underworld story fades into the background like a dream you can't quite quote, but you still feel its mood in your bones, that sense of rules and gates and unseen officials. The stars above remain steady. The streets below begin to smell different. Less incense, more sweat and wood, and something metallic that doesn't belong to mud brick. You follow that scent the way you'd follow a faint song because it doesn't fit the environment, and anything that doesn't fit is automatically interesting at night. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia lacked many key raw materials like stone, timber, and metal, and that Sumerian cities depended on long-distance trade to acquire them. Archaeology suggests trade networks connected Mesopotamia to regions rich in resources, bringing in items like copper, tin, precious stones and timber. The evidence we do have points to a practical reality. If your land is mostly mud and reeds, you need friends, roots and deals to build anything that lasts. You reach a busier area where the night hasn't fully shut down. A few lamps glow near a storage yard. You see stacks of baskets, coils of rope, and bundles wrapped in cloth. Someone mutters to someone else, and the tone is weary, as if they've been negotiating all day and are only now counting what arrived. You step closer and see a glint in the lamplight. Not gold, something more common, more workmanlike. Copper perhaps, a tool, a blade, a small ingot. What's broadly accepted is that metalworking and access to metal transformed ancient economies and technologies, and the early Mesopotamian societies valued imported metals for tools, weapons, and prestige objects. Archaeology suggests that the presence of foreign materials is often a clue to trade and contact. The evidence we do have points to a city that is not isolated. It is connected by invisible strings to distant mountains and distant coastlines. One interpretation is that exotic goods arriving from far away could feel like gifts from another world, especially to someone who has never seen a mountain in their life. A more cautious explanation could be that trade is simply trade, people moving resources for profit and survival. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if descent from heaven language sometimes attaches to imported materials because they appear suddenly in a city that cannot produce them, like a miracle with invoices? You watch as a trader or worker unwraps a package. Inside, something dark and glossy catches the light. A stone maybe. Lapis lazuli is the famous one in later imagination, but you don't need to name it with certainty tonight. The point is, the colour deep blue, like the night sky, condensed into a solid piece you can hold. Archaeology suggests that precious stones and luxury items travelled long distances into Mesopotamia, and that such goods held both material and symbolic value. What's broadly accepted is that elite and temple institutions often controlled or displayed these items. The evidence we do have points to a simple psychological effect. When you hold something rare, you start telling rarer stories about it. Historians still argue whether certain mythic descriptions of divine splendour and heavenly materials were inspired primarily by real luxury goods entering the region through trade, or whether they developed independently as symbolic language that later matched the aesthetics of imported items. That debate matters because it shapes how you read the imagery. It keeps you from assuming that because a story sounds like a description of a rare stone, the stone must be the origin of the story. Sometimes story leads, sometimes object follows, sometimes they just meet in the middle and nod. You move through the storage yard and notice the people. Their faces are tired but alert. Trade is opportunity, and opportunity requires attention. Someone is counting jars, someone is measuring cloth, someone is checking seals. Even at night, this is not a place where you can relax completely. Most historians agree that trade brought not only goods, but also ideas, artistic motifs, and stories. Archaeology suggests that cultural exchange is visible in materials, styles, and sometimes in borrowed symbols. The evidence we do have points to a city that is porous, absorbing influences like a sponge absorbs water. One interpretation is that stories of divine visitors could intensify in a world where strangers routinely arrive with unfamiliar languages and unfamiliar objects. A more cautious explanation could be that myths are not simply misunderstandings of foreigners, but deep cultural narratives with their own logic. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Anunnaki came idea in some modern imaginations is partly fueled by how trade makes the world feel bigger and stranger, especially when you live under a sky you read as meaningful? You catch a sound, a low argument, not angry, more like bargaining. Two people are negotiating over an item you can't quite see. The negotiation feels ritualistic in its own way, with repeated phrases and gestures, as if commerce has its own sacred script. And here comes your small joke, because your sleepy host brain can't resist. The first international trade agreement was probably someone saying, "This copper is totally high quality," while the other person squints and says, "Sure, and I'm totally a god." Some things never change. Archaeology suggests that standardized weights, measures and seals were used to manage exchange and guarantee authenticity. What's broadly accepted is that administrative systems supported trade because trust needs paperwork even in the Bronze Age. The evidence we do have points to a world where the same scribal habits that tracked barley also tracked exotic goods. One interpretation is that this system of seals and records could make the arrival of foreign materials feel officially sanctioned and therefore symbolically elevated. A careful reading might suggest that divine language sometimes overlaps with economic language, because both are about legitimacy. A more cautious explanation could be that we, as modern listeners, are the ones linking them too tightly. Now, because this is the section where modern mystery theories love to lean in the mist, layer steps forward labelled and calm. A fringe idea proposes that some imported materials were not just rare but anomalous, and that ancient stories about heavenly objects reflect contact with something beyond normal trade. A popular rumour claims that certain Sumerian artifacts or descriptions hint at advanced technology or off-world origin, and that the Anunnaki story is tied to these exotic arrivals. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin and often filtered through modern retellings. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes cinematic wonder, not a claim of confirmed alien cargo shipments. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Long-distance trade can explain the presence of rare materials and foreign goods without invoking non-human sources, and mainstream archaeology generally interprets these items within human exchange networks. Still, the feeling of strangeness is real. When something arrives from far beyond your horizon, it can feel like it came from the sky because the journey is invisible to you. You step back onto solid ground again. You look at the goods and realize how much of civilization is built from imported wonder. A city without stone imports stays mud. A city with stone imports becomes monumental. A city with metal becomes sharper both in tools and in power. Most historians agree that control of resources and trade routes influenced political strength and social stratification. Archaeology suggests elites and temples often played central roles in managing valuable goods. The evidence we do have points to trade being both a lifeline and a lever of control. One interpretation is that myths of divine gifts and divine decrees might echo real economic realities. Access is restricted, distribution is controlled, and authority claims cosmic backing. A more cautious explanation could be that myth and economy are parallel systems, each with its own language, sometimes borrowing metaphors from each other. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Anunnaki in some contexts are a narrative way to talk about the ultimate source of authority behind distribution? The highest council that decides who gets what, whether that council is divine, political, or both. You notice a small seal impression on a lump of clay near a bundle. The imprint is crisp and it carries a symbol you can't fully pass in the dimness, but you recognize the gesture stamp certify control. The reed stylus motif is joined by the seal motif now. Writing and stamping, marking and owning. The city runs on marks. You inhale slowly. The metallic smell fades as you move away. The night grows quieter again. Trade is exciting, but it's also exhausting, and the city seems to exhale as the goods are stored and the negotiations end. You keep walking, and you carry a new understanding with you. Foreign materials can make myths feel more literal, not because they prove anything, but because they sharpen the imagination. A rare stone looks like a piece of night sky. A metal tool feels like power in your hand. A stranger's language sounds like enchantment. And in that atmosphere, words like came down and those above become easier to picture as arrival. Historians still argue whether the strongest driver of myth evolution was environmental experience, political ideology, cross-cultural exchange, or the internal logic of ritual tradition. There's no full consensus, and you don't need one to keep moving. Tonight you're following the slow, quiet logic of the city itself. And the city, like a patient teacher, keeps showing you the same lesson in different forms. The world grows bigger and the stories grow with it. You leave the storage yard behind and the metallic scent fades until it's only a memory. The city returns to its usual nighttime palette, smoke clay, warm brick, and the faint sweetness of grain. The stars above feel calmer again, as if they approve of you stepping away from commerce and back towards something quieter. You follow a narrow street that bends and bends again, and you realize you've developed a new instinct. You can tell where scribes live, not by a sign on the door, but by the way the light leaks out late, by the way the space feels organized, by the way stacks of clay sit like books waiting to be read. Most historians agree that scribal education in Mesopotamia was rigorous and central to preserving literature, religion, and administration. Archaeology suggests scribal schools train students to copy texts, memorize lists, and master complex writing systems, often through repetitive practice. The evidence we do have points to a culture where knowledge was physically manufactured. You didn't just learn. You produced tablets. You step into a courtyard where a few young apprentices are still awake. Their posture tells the whole story, tired, focused, quietly resentful, and also strangely proud. A teacher-like figure sits nearby, calm as a stone, because only someone very experienced can be that calm around teenagers. One interpretation is that scribal schools were not just about literacy, but about shaping a worldview, training students to see order, hierarchy, and tradition as natural. A more cautious explanation could be that this is what any formal education does in any era. Still, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the texts that survive are not simply what people believed, but what scribal institutions chose to preserve, polish, and repeat? You watch an apprentice press wedge after wedge into clay, copying signs with a devotion that looks almost religious. The reed stylus makes tiny clicks as it meets the wet surface. The sound is oddly soothing, like a soft metronome for thought. Archaeology suggests many school tablets show repetitive exercises, sign lists, vocabulary, simple phrases, and sometimes copied literary passages. What's broadly accepted is that students learned by imitation. The evidence we do have points to tradition being transmitted through copying, which means tradition can be stabilized, but it can also be quietly edited. A careful reading might suggest that copying is never neutral. Even when you try to reproduce a text exactly, you leave fingerprints, spelling shifts, phrasing changes, emphasis, slides. One interpretation is that over generations scribes could smooth sharp edges in stories, align myths with changing theology, and subtly reshape how divine terms were used. A more cautious explanation could be that many changes were accidental or practical, not conspiratorial. And what if in gentle imagination you picture a scribe choosing a safer wording at midnight, not because they're hiding aliens, but because they want their teacher to stop yelling? Historians still argue whether the differences we see between versions of Mesopotamian texts reflect intentional editorial agendas, local traditions, scribal creativity, or the normal drift of copying over centuries. That debate is important because it keeps you from treating any one tablet as the final original voice. The past is a choir, not a solo. You step closer to a shelf where older tablets rest. These aren't exercises. They're full compositions, the kind that take time to copy because you have to get them right. You see hymns, myths, ritual instructions, maybe legal excerpts. The room feels like a library before libraries had their modern smell. Most historians agree that scribal culture preserved and transmitted literature, including myths, that later became famous through their influence on subsequent traditions. Archaeology suggests that schools often taught canonical texts reinforcing cultural identity. The evidence we do have points to a system where learning and power are intertwined. Those who write shape what counts as reality. One interpretation is that scribes were gatekeepers of the divine vocabulary, deciding which words were used for which gods, which groups were emphasized, which stories were told and retold. A careful reading might suggest that terms like Anunnaki could be framed differently depending on theological trends and institutional priorities. A more cautious explanation could be that the term's variability reflects genuine diversity rather than a single centralized editing process. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the most meaningful arrival in this entire topic is not a being from the sky, but the arrival of standardized education? The moment a society begins to train people to reproduce the same words in the same order across generations like a cultural heartbeat. You can't help a small joke because the scene feels familiar in a modern way. Ancient homework. If you've ever written something 50 times because a teacher said, so you can almost hear the apprentice's inner voice, "Yes, I understand the wedge shape. I have become one with the wedge. Please let me sleep. Some eras change, some don't." Now the mist layer approaches for a moment, because this is the section where people often ask quietly, if texts were copied and edited, could something have been removed? A fringe idea proposes that scribal schools may have preserved only a sanitized surface, while older stranger claims were altered or lost, including claims about extraordinary visitors. A popular rumour claims that they edited the tablets to hide the truth about the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often overestimates how centralized and coordinated ancient scribal culture was across cities and centuries. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a way to acknowledge that texts can change without pretending we know the direction or intention of every change. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Copying can create variation, and institutions can shape what survives, but mainstream scholarship generally explains most textual change through cultural evolution, local tradition, and practical scribal processes rather than a single secret cover-up. You step back onto solid ground. You watch the teacher correct an apprentice's sign, a small gesture but full of meaning. The teacher presses the stylus in a slightly different angle and suddenly the wedge looks right. That tiny correction is the mechanism by which a civilization keeps its language consistent. It's almost tender if you forget the part where the apprentice's hand is cramping. Archaeology suggests that scribes also used colophons and other markers to identify texts, sometimes noting the scribe or the context. What's broadly accepted is that some scribes took pride in accuracy and tradition. The evidence we do have points to a human desire to get it right, to preserve what matters, even when you're tired. One interpretation is that scribal pride could make certain myths more stable because scribes would try to copy canonical versions. A more cautious explanation could be that stability and variation coexisted. Some texts became standardized while others remained fluid. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the very existence of variation is what keeps the mystery alive? If every tablet said exactly the same thing, the modern imagination would have fewer places to hide. Historians still argue whether the texts we have represent the everyday beliefs of the broader population or primarily the curated worldview of scribal and temple elites. That debate is a reminder that when you hear the Sumerians, believed you should hear it as shorthand, not as a single voice. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You step out of the courtyard and back into the street. The night feels quieter now, as if your mind has absorbed the rhythm of school repeat, copy, correct, preserve. The read stylus motif feels heavier, not because it weighs more, but because you understand what it carries. You look up at the stars again, and you realise something. If the Anunnaki story feels powerful, part of that power comes from the fact that scribes made words durable. Without scribes, the myths might have dissolved into air. With scribes, they became clay. And that means the next question is not only what do the stories say, but who decided which stories mattered enough to copy? You keep walking slow and steady because the city's quiet is still doing its work on you. It is making you calmer even as it gives you more to wonder about. You walk out of the scribal courtyard with a strange new tenderness for repetition. The night feels quieter, but your mind is fuller layered with images. The angle of a reed stylus, the crispness of a seal, the tremble of starlight in a bowl of water. The city seems to be built from small acts done again and again until they become reality. You follow a street that slopes slightly upward. The air is cooler here, and you can smell baked brick more strongly, as if the walls are releasing the day's heat in slow waves. Ahead, you see a low building with a door half open, and inside a pile of broken clay fragments sits in a shallow basket like a nest of shattered shells. You pause because this is where the night becomes honest. Most historians agree that a large portion of Mesopotamian texts survive only in fragments, often broken, worn, or context lost. Archaeology suggests tablets were discarded, reused, damaged by time, or preserved by accident, and that modern understanding depends on incomplete pieces. The evidence we do have points to a humbling fact. You are not reading a full book. You are reading what survived. You step closer and look at the fragments. Some have a few clear wedges. Some have only partial lines. Some are so worn you can barely tell where a sign begins. The broken edges feel sharp under your fingertips, and the clay dust clings to your skin. One interpretation is that gaps in the record invite imagination, because the human mind hates unfinished sentences. A more cautious explanation could be that missing material simply means missing information, and responsible reading requires restraint. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the mystery around terms like Anunnaki grows partly because so many lines are missing, so many contexts are incomplete, so many maybe spaces exist where certainty cannot fit? Historians still argue whether certain disputed interpretations of Mesopotamian texts arise mainly from genuine ambiguity in the sources from translation, challenges from selective reading, or from modern storytelling desires that fill gaps too confidently. That debate matters because it's your safety rail. It keeps you from falling into the idea that every gap is a hidden message. Sometimes a gap is just a broken tablet. The ancient world was not always trying to whisper secrets to you. Sometimes it was just living, and the clay didn't make it. You notice that the fragments are sorted, not randomly piled. Someone has tried to organize them, perhaps a scribe salvaging damaged records, perhaps an apprentice practicing reconstruction, perhaps simply a worker cleaning. The act of sorting broken pieces feels deeply human. You can't help it. You see yourself in it. Archaeology suggests that in modern times, scholars reconstruct texts by comparing fragments, identifying sign patterns, and matching duplicates across collections. What's broadly accepted is that reconstruction is slow, careful work, and often uncertain. The evidence we do have points to reading the past being an act of patience, not a dramatic revelation. You imagine a modern scholar under a lamp not so different from the one you've been following all night, turning a fragment to the light and squinting. And you imagine the scholar whispering something like, "This might be the same line as that other fragment," with that cautious excitement that feels almost like prayer. One interpretation is that the uncertainty of reconstruction makes ancient texts especially vulnerable to overconfident modern claims. A more cautious explanation could be that uncertainty is normal in ancient history, and scholars are trained to communicate degrees of confidence. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the true lesson here is humility? The past is not obligated to be complete. Now the quirky edge returns, because you can't have a mystery story without someone somewhere making a bold claim. In modern circles, you'll sometimes hear a popular rumour claims that missing tablets contain the real truth about the Anunnaki, and that what survives is only the approved surface. This idea leans on the fact of fragmentation to imply intention. To be clear, this is debated. The evidence for a coordinated ancient suppression of the truth is thin in mainstream archaeology, and fragmentation can be explained by normal processes: decay, breakage, reuse, fire burial time. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a way to acknowledge the emotional pull of gaps without turning gaps into proof. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Missing evidence is not evidence of a specific hidden claim. It is simply missing evidence. The solid ground is that texts are incomplete, and interpretation must remain cautious. You step away from the fragments and look at the city again. The temple is still there in the distance, a dark layered silhouette. The canals still breathe. The stars still watch. It's almost comforting that the universe doesn't care whether your tablet corner is missing. It will keep spinning anyway. Most historians agree that translation itself can introduce ambiguity, because ancient words may not map cleanly onto modern concepts. Archaeology suggests that context matters deeply. The same sign can carry different meanings depending on genre, period, and surrounding lines. The evidence we do have points to a simple challenge: you are reading an ancient language through modern eyes. One interpretation is that modern fascination with the Anunnaki is partly a translation phenomenon, where a term that had flexible ancient associations becomes a singular modern identity. A more cautious explanation could be that the term genuinely carried multiple roles across texts, and modern summaries oversimplify for storytelling. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Anunnaki puzzle is not about one answer, but about learning to hold multiple meanings without forcing them into a single shape? Historians still argue whether modern popular interpretations of Mesopotamian mythology reflect genuine alternative readings of ancient texts, or primarily modern myth-making layered onto ancient material. That debate is not just academic, it's psychological. It's about why humans want the past to deliver a secret. You walk along the street and notice a small object near a doorway, a broken jar handle. It's ordinary, but it's also a metaphor waiting to happen. The handle used to connect. Now it's a fragment. You can infer the jar, but you cannot hold the original. The past is like that. You can infer. You can reconstruct, but you can't always drink the full story. A careful reading might suggest that responsible mystery storytelling keeps that in view. It doesn't say confirmed, it says suggestive. It doesn't say undeniable, it says one interpretation is. It doesn't pretend the mist is solid ground. And that brings you to a calmer way of viewing the whole topic. You can honour the documented history, real cities, real canals, real temples, real scribal schools, real texts. You can explore interpretation, how myths reflect politics, environment, and social order. And you can allow gentle imagination. What if the stories point at something else without claiming you've solved it? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Now, because your mind likes one more little spark before it settles you, picture a broken tablet that once contained a line about those who came down. In the fragment you have, the line is missing its ending. That missing ending becomes a screen onto which the modern imagination projects everything it wants. Aliens, secrets, forbidden history. But you can also project something more grounded: authority, ritual, poetry, the feeling of being watched by the sky. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You step into a quieter lane and hear nothing but your own breathing. The city seems to lull you with its incompleteness. It doesn't demand you solve it. It simply offers you shards and invites you to be gentle with them. You keep walking because the night is not finished yet, and the next turn of the path will bring you closer to modern retellings. And the way they pull these ancient shards into new shapes, sometimes beautiful, sometimes reckless, often both. For now, you let the broken fragments do what they do best. They soften your certainty. They slow your mind. They remind you that sleep and history share something important. Both are made of partial memories stitched together into a story you can live with. You keep walking and the city begins to blur at the edges. Not because you're lost, but because your mind is starting to slide into that softer nighttime state where images overlap. The broken tablet fragments from the last street still hover in your imagination like little moons, each one reflecting a different possible meaning. Ahead you notice a faint glow that doesn't belong to a temple lamp. It's colder, more modern in feeling like the light of a screen. Of course there is no screen here in ancient Sumer, but your brain, half asleep, likes to layer centuries together. And in a way that's exactly what this section is about. Later retellings, modern myths, and the gravity they add to old words. Most historians agree that Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian myths were transmitted and transformed over long periods, with later cultures adapting earlier traditions and modern audiences further reshaping them through translation, popular books, documentaries, and internet storytelling. Archaeology suggests our access to these myths comes through surviving texts, scholarly reconstruction, and modern interpretation. The evidence we do have points to a simple truth: stories do not stay still, they travel. You walk past a small group of people speaking quietly near a doorway, and the way they speak sounds surprisingly familiar. Not the language, but the vibe. It's the vibe of people comparing interpretations, arguing over meanings, and trying to sound confident about something that is, at the end of the day, complicated. One interpretation is that every era rebuilds the past in its own image, using ancient stories as raw material for modern hopes and fears. A more cautious explanation could be that reinterpretation is unavoidable when texts cross languages and cultures. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the modern obsession with the Anunnaki is less about ancient Sumer and more about modern longing for a dramatic explanation of human origins? You can feel that longing in the way certain phrases get repeated. Hidden truth, forbidden knowledge. They don't want you to know. Those phrases are powerful because they make the listener feel chosen. But tonight, you're not here to be chosen. You're here to be calm. What's broadly accepted is that sensational modern retellings often simplify complex scholarship and elevate fringe interpretations into the spotlight. The evidence we do have points to careful historians and archaeologists using cautious language, while popular media often prefers certainty and drama. One interpretation is that this gap between scholarship and entertainment creates fertile soil for myths to grow. A more cautious explanation could be that popular storytelling is not obligated to match academic nuance, though it can still aim for honesty. Historians still argue whether modern ancient astronaut-style narratives represent genuine alternative interpretation of mythic language or primarily modern myth-making that projects contemporary ideas onto ancient texts. That debate is the bridge between worlds. It's where you decide how to hold what you've heard. Now gently, you step into the modern myth zone without treating it as fact. You acknowledge it as a cultural phenomenon. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth and influenced human development, and that ancient texts preserve this event as disguised history. A popular rumour claims that governments or academic institutions suppress this truth. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it relies heavily on interpretation selective reading and modern narrative frameworks rather than strong archaeological confirmation. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a story about how humans make meaning, not a claim that we have solved the past. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is reasonable to explore why certain myths sound like arrival stories, but it is not responsible to state as fact that aliens came to Earth based solely on myth language. The solid ground remains the documented existence of texts, cities, and religious traditions, and the mist remains the speculative leap to literal extraterrestrial contact. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now you notice how modern retellings often pull certain details forward and push others back. They focus on the dramatic words like came down and created, while ignoring the rations, the canal maintenance, the school exercises, the slow bureaucracy of life. But archaeology suggests the everyday is where meaning is anchored. Most historians agree that Sumerian civilization is best understood through both its grand myths and its practical records, because the two are intertwined. One interpretation is that when modern stories strip out the mundane, they make the ancient world feel more like a movie and less like a lived place. A more cautious explanation could be that entertainment chooses emphasis by design. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real wonder is not a secret visitor, but the fact that ordinary humans built systems so complex that later generations can barely imagine them? You pass a small open courtyard and hear a faint echo of laughter. Someone somewhere is still awake and amused by something. That's the most grounding sound in the world. It reminds you that people have always been people. Now consider the way modern internet culture works. It takes fragments, it remixes them, it adds dramatic music, it posts them with bold captions, and it repeats them until repetition feels like evidence. A careful reading might suggest that repetition is not proof. It is just repetition. Historians debate for a reason. Historians still argue whether the popularity of Anunnaki theories reflects a genuine gap in mainstream explanations for early civilization, or simply the modern appetite for mystery narratives in an age of distrust and information overload. There's no full consensus, and that's okay. Tonight, you don't need consensus. You need a gentle separation of layers. So you do a quiet mental sorting the way a scribe sorts fragments. Documented cities on floodplains, canals, temples, scribes, trade networks, myths written in clay. Interpreted myths reflecting social hierarchy, environmental anxiety, political legitimacy, and human psychology. Imagine what if a rival language points to something beyond metaphor without claiming it's confirmed? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You realise that modern retellings sometimes turn the Anunnaki into a single storyline with a single conclusion. But the ancient material is not a single storyline. It is many story threads tangled together. One interpretation is that the healthiest long-term way to approach these myths is to treat them like a river delta. Many channels, some dry, some flowing, changing shape over time. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Anunnaki obsession is a modern mirror, showing how much we crave a parent story, an origin that feels intentional, a reason we are here? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and modern minds hate that. We want the mist to be solid. You breathe slowly and feel the city's night settle around you again. The temples are still mud brick. The canals still need maintenance. The scribes still press wedges. The modern internet drama is far away like thunder in another country. You can acknowledge it without letting it run your nervous system. You offer yourself one final small joke before sleep pulls you deeper. If the Anunnaki really did come to Earth and saw the paperwork involved in running a temple economy, they might have turned around and gone right back to space. Nope. Too many forms. Even cosmic beings have limits. Now you keep walking because the story still has one more shape to take. You've explored the documents, the interpretations, the modern myths. What remains is synthesis and quiet closure, the honest kind that doesn't slam a door but gently turns the latch. And as you move through the last stretch of night, you carry the most monetization-safe truth of all: the past is fascinating, the evidence is partial. The interpretations are many, and wonder does not require certainty. You keep walking, and the city begins to thin into something quieter than streets. The buildings sit lower, the lamps are fewer, the sky feels larger, like it has finally reclaimed most of the frame. Your mind, which has been holding so many layers at once, starts to loosen its grip, the way a hand relaxes when it realizes it doesn't have to keep carrying the bowl. The temple silhouette is still visible in the distance, but softer now, as if the night has wrapped it in cloth. The canals breathe somewhere beyond the walls, and the reeds whisper a papery hush. You can almost hear the reed stylus again, that tiny clicking metronome of civilization. But it's quieter too, like the scribes have finally gone to sleep. Most historians agree that Sumer left an extraordinary record of ordinary life, preserved through clay tablets that document everything from rations to hymns. Archaeology suggests that these records, though incomplete, offer some of the earliest sustained glimpses of urban administration, religion, and storytelling. The evidence we do have points to something steady and human people trying to live well in a demanding landscape, using systems and stories to make the world manageable. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki, when you hold them carefully, belong primarily to that world of story and structure, a divine category that reflects how Mesopotamians imagined authority, fate, and the unseen architecture of existence. A more cautious explanation could be that the term's meaning shifts across time and genre, and that modern summaries often oversimplify what was originally flexible and layered. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the power of the Anunnaki idea, ancient and modern, comes from the same place? The desire to believe that there is an order behind the noise, a council behind the chaos, a reason behind the river's moods. Historians still argue whether the deepest function of Mesopotamian divine group language was theological description, political symbolism, social reinforcement, or psychological comfort. There's no full consensus, and you don't need one to rest. In fact, resting in uncertainty is one of the kindest things you can do for your mind, because certainty, when it's forced, becomes a kind of strain. Now you do the gentle synthesis that the night has been preparing you for. You hold 3 layers soft in your hands without mixing them into a single hard claim. What's broadly accepted is that Sumer's growth depended on water management, labour organisation, temple economies, and scribal systems. The evidence we do have points to real people doing real work, building cities out of mud, and planning out of necessity. Archaeology suggests a complex civilization that changed over centuries and left traces we can still read. One interpretation is that myths, including those involving divine assemblies, and terms like Anunnaki reflect that complexity, using cosmic language to speak about social order, environmental anxiety, and the legitimacy of institutions. A careful reading might suggest that dissent and decree often function as poetic ways to describe authority becoming present and rules becoming binding. And then gently the imagined layer kept honest? What if the story is pointing at something else? What if certain phrases were chosen because they preserve a feeling that the ancient world experienced under the stars, a feeling that something larger was near, something that could not be proven, but also could not be fully dismissed? We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues, and in the end, it's okay to leave the door slightly open without pretending you walk through it. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And for literal extraterrestrial contact, the mainstream evidence remains thin. That's not an insult to wonder. It's a boundary that keeps wonder from becoming misleading. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal visitors who came to Earth and shaped human fate. A popular rumour claims that ancient texts are coded reports of contact. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it relies heavily on modern framing rather than firm archaeological confirmation. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes one more way humans explore the unknown, not a final verdict on history. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts are real, the myths are real, the fascination is real, but the leap to certainty is where honesty slips. Tonight we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You notice how calm that feels. The moment you stop trying to force a single hidden truth, your mind can breathe again. The story becomes what it always should have been for a sleep-friendly night, a gentle river of images, facts and questions, not a courtroom demanding a verdict. You slow your steps and look at the ground. The packed earth is smooth in places, rutted in others. You imagine the thousands of feet that pressed it down. You imagine the workers carrying baskets, the scribes carrying tablets, the priests carrying offerings. You imagine the small domestic moments too, someone sweeping a courtyard, someone laughing softly, someone feeling tired and hoping the river behaves tomorrow. Most historians agree that the enduring miracle of Sumer is not a single myth, but the sheer continuity of human life that the tablets reveal: cooking, counting, praying, trading, teaching, rebuilding. Archaeology suggests the past was not a single dramatic event. It was a long sequence of ordinary days. One interpretation is that the most honest way to talk about what happened during any mythic era is to remember that the texts themselves are layered, curated and incomplete. A more cautious explanation could be that what happened is often the wrong question for myth. The better question is what the story helped people hold. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if in the deepest sense the Anunnaki came whenever the night sky and the temple system together made people feel the presence of authority beyond the human scale? Now the wind down begins, and you let your language soften your pace, slow your sentences lengthen, the way they do when you're nearly asleep and the world is no longer asking you to be sharp. You imagine yourself sitting at the edge of a canal, just outside the city walls, where the water moves slowly and the reeds sway in a gentle rhythm, brushing each other with that dry whisper that sounds almost like pages turning. The stars above are steady, and you don't need to name them, because names are for waking hours and this hour is for quiet. You can picture a scribe somewhere back inside the city, setting down a reed stylus after a long day, flexing a cramped hand, and watching the lamp flame settle into a smaller, calmer point of light. You can picture a worker lying down on a reed mat, listening to the distant murmur of water, letting the day's worries dissolve into that soft, steady sound. You can picture the temple silhouette, dark and patient, not menacing, just present like a mountain made of human effort and belief. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination, and you don't have to choose between them tonight. You can let the documented facts be the ground beneath you, firm and quiet. You can let interpretation be the path that curves gently through the city, giving shape and meaning without forcing certainty. You can let imagination be the mist over the water, beautiful and temporary, reminding you that not knowing everything is not a failure. It's simply part of being human under a large sky. And as your breathing slows, you can let the Anunnaki be what they most safely are in a sleep story. A symbol of the unknown, a name for the feeling that history holds more than we can fully confirm, and that wonder can exist without panic, without fear, without needing to be proven. The river keeps moving, the stars keep shining, the city keeps sleeping. Your mind can rest, too, floating gently between solid ground and soft mist, letting the night carry you one quiet breath at a time.